The stories you are about to hear are true. Some names and locations have been changed at the author's discretion. Welcome to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories.
My friend Roger. So, the house I grew up in is haunted. It's a little old, but not too old, built in 1950, and doesn't have any stairs or a second floor or a basement. My mother and my birth father were only the second owners. My parents are now divorced, and they bought it from this old couple, and the mother-in-law or something was an invalid who passed away there. In my room, no less. Yay for me! So I'm not sure about any of the other house history. I've never bothered to research it. But these are some interesting little tidbits and things that happened to me over the years. When I was little, around 3 or 5 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Roger. Okay, my mom and everyone around me at the time said he was imaginary, but he wasn't. I swear up and down he wasn't. I'm 31 now, and I will still tell you he was real. I mean, real enough to me. I had no idea about ghosts and stuff at that age. So he would come out of the closet in my old room. Old lady died in my room that I had as a teenager, and would want to play with me. He was a nice kid. I can still tell you what he looked like. He just played with me. I can't remember much about what we played, except he liked me to sit in the closet sometimes and talk with him. My mom thought I was full of it when I'd tell her I was playing with Roger, and I thought she was full of it because she couldn't see this kid sitting right there playing with me. But she eventually believed because she said that when I was not home, someone would play with my toys and leave them out. I had this rocking chair that played music when it rocked, and she said it would play the music when I wasn't home. I'd tell her it was Roger, but he stopped coming around when I started going to school. I remembered I had asked him why he never came out anymore, and he said it's because I had new friends, and I would be okay. Weird, right? So fast forward 20-odd years, and my mother tells me that my niece is now playing with Roger in the same house. She had heard her playing and being loud in the room with someone. My mom asked my niece. She just looked at her and said, "It's my friend Roger." My mom called me to tell me because she couldn't believe it. We hadn't discussed Roger in years, so there wasn't any way my niece could have overheard us or anything. She was 3 at the time. Now it's 2009. My other niece, who is 4, tells my mother and sister and anyone who will listen that she plays with this little boy who's looking for his mommy. She always points to a corner of the room and tells everybody that he's sitting there very scared and she just wants to play. When my sister asked her what the little boy's name was, you guessed it, it was Roger. I told everyone he wasn't imaginary. The scariest time of my life. I was a pretty wild teen, and so was my best friend. In this story, I will call her Jenny. Jenny and her family moved about an hour away from our hometown when we were 14, so during summer break I would go and stay with her. We mostly had the house alone since her mom worked out of town during the week. Heaven for teenagers, right? So on a Thursday night, we had ordered a pizza and had another friend bring us some booze, and we decided to just chill out and watch some scary movies for most of the night. It was around midnight when we started hearing weird noises outside. At first we chalked it up to just hearing things because of the movies we were watching. But then we started hearing footsteps on her porch, and we got scared. We cut off the movie and went and grabbed knives out of the kitchen and random blunt objects from around the house. We all hoarded up in her bedroom and called her mom. She told us to calm down because she had sent her brother to check on us, and he was probably just trying to scare us. So we calmed down a little and didn't hear anything else. Her uncle came by about an hour later and swore he wasn't up there because the shift had ended late and he couldn't have been there. He ended up staying with us the rest of the night. Fast forward to Friday night. Jenny's mom came home and we felt way safer. So 2 a.m. rolls around, and being bored teenagers, we decided to sneak out. We walked about 2 miles from her house, and we started getting a feeling we were being followed. I told her we should turn around and just head back home. We had walked maybe 10 minutes when we heard a chainsaw start up and what sounded like a dying cow. We ran as fast as we could back to her driveway. The whole time we could hear something behind us and the chainsaw being turned on and off. We jumped the fence at her driveway and ran up the hill. When we looked back, we saw from what we could tell by the streetlight an older man with black pants and a thick sweater. He kept watch out of her window all night, even though he went away when we went into the house. Saturday rolls around and Jenny's mom gets drunk. So do we, but she didn't know we were because she was pretty lit. So we all get bored and decided to play hide-and-seek in the backyard that night. We were having fun, being carefree, when all of a sudden we hear Jenny's mom, and I'll call her Stacy, start screaming her head off. We come out of our hiding spots to ask what's wrong. She told us that she thought she had seen an old man peeking from behind a bush in the lower part of the yard. Jenny and I decided to tell her what had happened the previous night, despite the fact that we could have gotten in trouble. We all decided to keep a lookout and see if we saw this man again, and if so, to call her brother, who I mentioned earlier, but forgot to tell you he's a cop. So we went to sit on the porch. We didn't see anything for a while and had almost completely calmed down. And then I saw movement from the corner of my eye, and I'll be damned if it wasn't the guy from the previous night, now standing at the edge of the house. I screamed. Jenny and Stacy saw him, and we ran into the house and locked the doors and called Stacy's brother. He came by, but by the time he did, the creepy guy was gone. He promised that he would drive by the house on the rest of his shift, and when he was finished with his patrol, he would come and stay with us. We don't know who this guy was or what the problem was, but we didn't see him anymore that whole summer. I went back home about 3 days before school started back up and ended up having a friend, Kim, over for a night. We stayed up pretty late that night. My bedroom was upstairs and I had my window open so we could blow our cigarette smoke out. Kim was at the window smoking, and suddenly she called my name and said that there was a weird guy standing at the top of my driveway. I jumped off my bed to look, and yeah, it was the same fucking guy from Jenny's house. I totally freaked out and went downstairs and told my mom. She called the cops, and they got there in record time, and the guy was arrested. Turns out this guy had a daughter who passed away, who looked like me, and he became obsessed with me when he saw him at my friend Jenny's house. To be around made him feel like he was close to her again. He had followed my parents and I home from Jenny's house so he could watch me. He said he was protecting me, but I assured him I didn't feel safe. From what I heard, he ended up in a mental institution. Scariest time of my life. I hope I never experience anything like that ever again. A possession. In early December 1974, while living in Tampa, Florida, I was out shopping for gifts when I was attracted to a display of Ouija boards. Thinking that one would make a good choice for my teenage niece, I purchased it, brought it home, and laid it on the dining room table to later wrap and mail. Earlier that evening, 3 friends, Bonnie, Dale, and Gwen, arrived to pick me up for the evening. We were all going to go out. As I dressed, Bonnie noticed the Ouija board on the table and inquired about it. "I have one at home," she said to me. "When I use it, I contact the spirit of a man who died a few years ago and had lived in Ybor City, which is a Tampa suburb." "That stuff is bullshit," said Dale, the ex-Marine sergeant that Bonnie was dating. As I explained how I came about making my purchase, Bonnie interrupted to ask if she could open the box and show Dale how the board was used. Gwen's bright eyes showed interest and excitement at the prospect and was soon busily following Bonnie's instructions. Nothing happened. Dale's sarcasm increased rapidly. Then, suddenly, the planchette began to move, rapidly spelling out coherent words and complete sentences. "Are there any messages for anyone here?" Bonnie asked. "Yes," the board indicated, and launched into a complicated message involving Bonnie's cousin, who lived in another state, and then ended with a dirty joke. I was amazed. The joke was one none of us had ever heard, and I thought it was certainly an unexpected finale. "If these things were real, they could tell you something nobody using it could possibly know," said Dale. "Go ahead and ask," said Bonnie, leaping to the challenge. "Okay. What's my mother's middle name?" Dale said, and took his hand off the planchette, relinquishing control to Bonnie and Gwen. The board rapidly spelled out a name that Dale watched as the letters appeared. He blanched. The 1 year out of Vietnam veteran actually turned pale. "Well?" we asked cautiously. Dale mumbled, "Nobody knows that," but never actually confirmed the truthfulness of the information. Since Dale wasn't the type of person one pushed for answers and we had spent over an hour on the board, I suggested we head out for dinner. Later, when Dale left the table, Bonnie asked if Gwen and I would like to get together sometime next week and try her Ouija board without Dale's negative presence. We agreed to meet without him. I did notice that Dale drank even more than usual that evening, but he never mentioned the Ouija board incident again. 3 nights later, the call came. I had half gotten our discussion, but Bonnie said she had already called Gwen, and if Sunday night was okay, then we were on. Sunday evening was still warm, even though by 7 o'clock the sun-shortened December day had changed to darkness. When Bonnie greeted me at the door, I could see Gwen sitting on the floor of the living room, leaning over a Ouija board. Bonnie had lit several candles, and a small lamp behind the sofa completed the ambience. "We contacted the guy Bonnie was telling us about," Gwen said. "He's been telling us about his no-good son who lives in Tampa and is in jail for a rape he committed." Gwen, who lived across the street from Bonnie, had dropped by first, and the two had gotten the board out and started early. I sat next to Bonnie and watched as the planchette started to move under her fingertips. Bonnie asked me to get some pen and paper and take down the letters as they were indicated. As we began, the words, though correctly spelled, followed a dialect one would expect from an uneducated person. As we continued, Bonnie asked if there were messages from or to anyone. It was then I began to notice changes in word usage and sentence structure, as if different personalities were communicating with us. The planchette was often moving much faster with the new personalities. I switched places with Bonnie, then with Gwen, and back again. With the speed and forcefulness of the planchette's movement, I could hardly believe they were not consciously directing it. As the skeptic in me started to question what was happening, I began to impose rules so that they could not possibly see the position of the board or planchette. I had them both turn and use one hand behind their backs. I rotated the board, I raised it above their heads, and still the planchette indicated sentence after sentence. "Bonnie, your grandmother is sick and is going to die. Your parents have taken her to the hospital." Bonnie's expression changed to total disbelief. "That's impossible," she said. "I was raised by my grandmother. If anything had happened to her, my mother would have called me at once." What had been light and fun took on a different tone. We tried to comfort Bonnie and turned back to the board, writing down a few more messages from different personalities. Bonnie's worry showed clearly. "If anything were wrong, my parents would call me," she said as if trying to convince herself. "Dale will be in a car wreck on New Year's Eve in the parking lot of Mickey's Bar. He will be seriously injured. Later, Dale's car sustained about $500 damage on New Year's Eve while parked at Mickey's Bar. He was not in the car, nor had we mentioned the message to him." A difficult-to-describe but very definite cold chill invaded the room. Bonnie got up and closed the windows and pulled the blinds and curtains. She sat back down and looked morose. "Look," I said, "I'll go out and get us a bottle of wine. Why don't you turn the lights up and put the board away?" When I returned, Bonnie was on the telephone to her mom, and Gwen was looking ill at ease. I caught the last part of the conversation as the tears rolled down Bonnie's cheeks. She was trying to convince her mother that she had just happened to call and everything was fine, but she really had to end the call then. "Her parents had just gotten back from the hospital," said Gwen. Bonnie's grandmother was admitted for observation. We sipped at the wine in a low-keyed way. Gwen and I exchanged looks that indicated it was time to leave, and Bonnie made noises about having a long day tomorrow. Gwen and I were off on Mondays. She owned a retail business, and I worked for a large corporation where Bonnie was a junior executive. Gwen and I had been dating for a few months and had ideas on how to spend the rest of the evening. "I'll just be a minute," said Gwen, walking into Bonnie's bedroom, heading for the bathroom. Bonnie and I made small talk, and I tried to reassure her about the night's events. A cold, depressing chill had invaded the room, and Bonnie pulled a comforter off the back of the sofa and wrapped it around her shoulders. Even with the lights up, something seemed gloomy and foreboding about the room. I looked toward the bedroom door, wondering about Gwen. "She sure is taking her time," said Bonnie, rising up from the sofa and walking into the hall to the bedroom. Suddenly, she yelled out, "Jim!" Gwen seemed to be passed out on the floor of the bedroom. I shook her and told Bonnie to get me a wet, cold washcloth. As a former police officer, I knew my first aid training and treatment for shock came immediately to mind, although I had no idea what she could be in shock from. Gwen was 29 years old, in great health, 5'3", 4 inches tall, and around 100 pounds on a small frame. She had consumed one small glass of wine. I could not awaken her. I laid the cloth across her forehead, told Bonnie to get me some pillows to elevate her feet, then changed my mind and decided to put her on the bed. Was this a bad joke? The thought crossed my mind. Bonnie's sewing table was next to me. I reached up and took a needle from a pincushion, and to test Gwen's reaction, stuck her arm with it. She didn't move or flinch. I stuck her again, harder this time. Nothing. I knelt beside her and lifted one eyelid. I still shudder when I recall the horrible, animalistic sight her eye had become. It was the bloodshot eye of a vulture-like demon. That's the best way I can describe it. I swallowed hard and glanced at Bonnie. Good, she hadn't seen it. "I'm going to try to put her on the bed," I said. "She'll be more comfortable there." "Has she ever had a fainting spell before?" I asked as I slipped my arms under her back and knees. Gwen's vulture eyes opened in a snap. The nails of her hand raked my face, leaving 4 angry wounds that started to bleed. In a flash, she was up and running out of the bathroom and toward the front door, screaming gutturally. Reacting, I think, out of instinct and training, I was only a step behind. Gwen, wait, what's happened? I cried out. Gwen jerked open the door. I slammed it before she could move. She turned and attacked me furiously. I had to protect myself, but I would not harm nor injure her in any way. Only our great difference in size and my training saved me. I immobilized her arms, hugged her to me from behind, and dropped my 180 pounds of weight body on top of her, pinning her completely. Again, she became completely comatose. Again, I could not awaken her. Bonnie stood in the hall, half hidden in shadow, wide-eyed, biting her knuckles. Her face was a blank stare. Help me get her into the bedroom, I said. I knew I had to get Bonnie involved in doing something, or I'd lose her. Because of the suddenness of the attack, I felt we wouldn't have any advance warning if Gwen or this thing that was Gwen decided to assault us again. I also knew that it wasn't playing games. I had been in enough altercations to know that Gwen was giving the fight all she had. We decided that I shouldn't let go of Gwen's wrists, so I asked Bonnie to carry the weight of her legs. Together we managed to get Gwen onto the bed with all the gentleness possible. "Oh, God," said Bonnie, trembling violently. It's something from that Ouija board. It's inside Gwen." I wasn't sure at the time, but now I think she was correct. But right then, every belief I had was being ripped away from the core of my being. Things I had known were impossible were happening, and they were happening to me. I was strangely silent as the realization of these conclusions hit me. What happened? What are we going to do? We exchanged the question about a dozen times in a dozen different ways in the next few minutes. Who to call? What to say? If we call a hospital, what can we tell them? Said Bonnie, then changed to a practice voice. Our friend is possessed by something that came out of a Ouija board. She's unconscious now, but she was grunting and drooling and trying to kill one of us. Yeah, they'd send an ambulance if they believed you. And the police, I said. If she became conscious and was still possessed, they'd put her in a mental ward. It would be on her record forever, and we can't do that to our friend. I knew what the police would say. Some squirrel call. I said it myself when I got the naked man out of the rain who screamed that Martians were beaming down through car antennas. The investigating officer would take one look at us, and I would probably be in jail for assault, and Gwen would be at the emergency room for drug tests and then into the psych ward. Back to square one. This stuff doesn't just happen, Jim, said Bonnie, sobbing deeply. She looked terrible, and I was sure I did too. How about a priest? Said Bonnie. I was raised Catholic. Don't they do exorcisms? Do you really think the modern church believes in possession? I said. A priest would think you were drunk on acid or just fucking crazy. Well, what about a psychiatrist? Psych ward for sure. Those people have to protect their reputations. If they admitted she was possessed, they'd be laughed out of their profession. Several hours had elapsed since the episode, and Bonnie's exhaustion was taking its toll. Her eyes had closed, and I thought she was dozing. I sat on the edge of the bed, half turned uncomfortably toward Gwen, still holding her wrists. The room had been getting stuffy from the lack of ventilation. Why had I felt uncomfortable about opening a window? Sweat from my forehead ran through my brows, and I felt the droplets on my eyelids. I shrugged my shoulders and tried unsuccessfully to wipe them away on the top of my sleeve. The wet washcloth lay temptingly on Bonnie's lap. A drop of sweat rolled past my lashes as I tried to blink it away. Slowly, I relaxed my grip on Gwen's arms. Her breathing remained steady as I slipped my thumbs from beneath her wrists. I paused and watched her carefully. There was no change as I let my hands rest on hers for a moment, then leaned forward to get the washcloth. Gwen leapt up and off the end of the bed in a blur, again heading toward the front door. I yelled for Bonnie as I began pursuit. This time was much the same as before, but both Gwen and I were more experienced and more wary. "Gwen, wait!" I pleaded. But it wasn't Gwen. Gwen was unreachable. This creature only resembled Gwen as some caricature of humanness. I half-twisted sideways and blocked a vicious kick, grabbed her arms and bear-hugged her. She twisted violently and spit in my face as I dropped with her to the floor. The nails of one hand dug into my side and ripped a short distance before I pulled away and immobilized her. Helpless now, Gwen collapsed back into insensibility. "Bonnie, help me!" I yelled through clenched teeth. Bonnie, I was afraid, was beginning to lose it. Deathly white and wide-eyed, she helped me carry Gwen back to the bedroom. She was sucking in air and crying. "Dear God, Heavenly Father, help us, please. Please get rid of this thing that has taken our friend Gwen. Please, God, please." Bonnie dropped to her knees at the side of the bed in supplication, her fingers interlaced in prayer. "Please take it from her," she said. If there is this much evil, there must be a force equally as good, I thought. So I prayed too. They say there are no atheists on the battlefield, and I too wanted to appeal to all the powers of good that there were. Please help us, anybody, I said out loud. I hadn't said a prayer since I had the measles when I was 6. A lot of changes were taking place in my thinking tonight. My crucifix, gasped Bonnie. I was raised Catholic. She reminded me again and rushed to her dresser and began going wildly through her drawers. She was trembling and crying with those deep sucking breaths a person makes just before getting hysterical. Bonnie, I snapped harshly. Don't you fucking flake out on me. Don't you leave me now. It began as an order and finished as a plea. The thought of facing this alone was terrifying. Bonnie found the crucifix and held it triumphantly in the air for a moment, and dropped to her knees again. We both resumed our prayers. She said to her God, and I to any and all who would listen. How do I get on the bed? My head snapped towards Gwen's face. Her eyes were open, clear and serene. Her voice was calm and normal. Instinctively, I released my grip. I don't know if we ever quite convinced Gwen of what truly had transpired. My bloody scratches and the corresponding skin under her nails seemed proof of the violence we recounted, and our state of shock and disarray was obvious, but she remembered nothing. Her last memory was walking towards the bathroom. Oh no, she said, looking at the clock. It's 3 a.m. I have to go home right now. Bonnie's eyes widened. You are not leaving me, Bonnie said forcefully. No, I thought. I certainly wasn't going to leave her either. We all lay down on Bonnie's bed. Soon Gwen was snoring peacefully. I knew Bonnie needed the rest and comfort, so I pulled her close to me and held her in my arms. We lay perfectly still without speaking. Much later, I turned my head slowly to see the clock. 4:30. Bonnie, I whispered. Yeah, she whispered back. She was wide awake. I hugged her gently. Neither one of us slept or moved until the first cracks of light appeared around the bedroom window. Jim, I have to get up. Watch me. Don't take your eyes off me, said Bonnie. Bonnie opened the blinds fully, and I followed her in the living room and kitchen. She carefully opened every blind and curtain to its fullest. The light seemed to begin a slow purification. I'm going to take a shower, she said. Please don't be embarrassed, but just watch me. She pulled the shower curtain back, too, as she walked into the bathroom. The water splashed on the floor. She stayed like that for a while, not caring that the floor was getting wet. Bonnie dried her hair for a long time, put on her makeup, and dressed unselfconsciously. She looked whipped. Gwen yawned and stretched. She said she was fine. I walked Gwen across the street to her place while Bonnie waited near her car. The full daylight seemed to help out a ton. I followed her a brief distance and cut off at my street. Later that afternoon, I checked on Gwen and went by Bonnie's office. She looked at me with dead eyes and pale exhaustion. You gonna be okay tonight, Bonnie? I asked. Did it really happen, Jim? Did that really happen? She said slowly. I just looked at her. Maybe denial's a form of healing, I thought. Bonnie and I never spoke of the incident again. Not even once. It's been many years, and we never bring it up. I don't know why. I'll never moon anyone again. This took place about 7 years ago when I was 14. My family and I had just moved halfway across the country from Ohio to Florida, so we didn't know many people, but we had started hanging out with 2 kids from up the street. One day my brother, for story purposes let's call him Kevin, and our 2 new friends, we'll call them Michael and Tony, and I were hanging out at the mall, which was right down the road from our house, pretty much all day, right until they closed. Okay, this is where things start to get creepy. As we were walking home, we were just joking around as young teenagers do, when my brother stepped off the curb and almost ran into an oncoming car. It started honking furiously at him and caused him to jump backwards, and then he flipped off the driver. We all thought this was hysterical and started to make a game out of it. We stood along the side of the road making increasingly rude gestures at passing drivers as the sun started to go down. Looking back on it now, I'm embarrassed to have been so obnoxious. It was getting late, so I suggested going home as we were still a few blocks from our house, and that's when Tony said, "All right, this is it for the win," pointing towards an oncoming truck. As the truck approached, he whipped around and revealed his naked ass to the driver, who immediately slammed on the brakes and screeched to a halt. We, thinking this was hilarious, took off running down a side street. After a couple of blocks, we stopped, and while we stood there slightly panting, we all congratulated Tony on his victory and started taking the back way home to avoid the angry driver. We were laughing and having a good time when this truck comes barreling down the road towards us. At first, I don't think anyone realized it was the same truck because we just stood there watching it. Then Kevin yelled, "That's the same guy!" I'm not proud of what happened next. "Run!" I yelled, and we all scattered. I didn't look back as I flew down the street, not even realizing I was running away from my house. I didn't hear anything behind me, so I jumped a fence and into someone's backyard, and there I crouched behind some rose bushes, breathing rapidly for what seemed like 20 minutes, but was probably closer to 5. Then I heard a thump, and saw my friend Michael shuffling towards me. "I think he's gone," he said in a hushed voice. "That guy's crazy," I whispered back. "I think he might be drunk," Michael responded. We stood up scanning the area and saw nothing, so we hopped back over the fence and headed warily down the street. "Did you see where Kevin went?" I asked. "Or what about Tony?" Michael shook his head, and I pulled out my phone to call my brother, but when I did, all I got was voicemail. "His phone must be off," I told Michael. As we got back to the spot where we had scattered, we started calling out for Kevin and Tony, but got no response. So we headed towards home, but not 10 seconds later, we hear a loud engine coming closer. Not knowing if it was the same truck and not wanting to take a chance, I told Michael to hide, and we took shelter behind a van that was in the driveway to our left. Sure enough, this truck comes slowly rolling down the street, and the man driving was yelling incoherently for us to come out wherever we were.
Come out, little boys, I just want to talk to you."
It was really creepy and got even worse when the porch light to the house we were in front of came on. The man stopped the truck and stopped yelling and just sat there. I was sweating and trying with all my might to not even breathe in case he might hear it. Then all of a sudden he drove off towards the main road. We took off running once again and finally got to our street where Kevin and Tony were sitting in front of Michael's house. They exploded into questions when they saw us. Apparently Kevin had headed straight for home when we all split, and Tony had run down another street and ended up at the park. The man had followed him, and as he hid behind a tree, the man had gotten out of his truck and stood screaming into the darkness for like 10 minutes before he turned to get back into his truck. Tony had taken that opportunity to run, but the man had seen him, and he had decided to run through yards until he ended up at Michael's, with Kevin hiding behind Michael's dad's car. That must have been when the man drove past Michael and I. It was probably the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, and I don't know what that man would have done if he caught us. But this is what I do know. I'll never moon anyone ever again. Something terrifying in the woods in my town. I'm from a small town in southwest Arkansas called Fouke. You've probably heard about it. It's famous for the Boggy Creek Monster. That monster is a Sasquatch-like creature who, in the 70s, allegedly terrorized my hometown and the surrounding area, which spawned a documentary movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek. I have never seen this ape-like creature, but have seen first-hand evidence of it, and far worse monsters out in the swamps and hills my family and I have hunted our entire lives. There are 1,000 stories I could tell, but the one that bothers me the most, and the one that I'm going to tell you now, is the reason I no longer feel safe in the backwoods of my own homeland. This happened in the evening when I was about 15. There are 1,000 stories I could tell here, but the one that bothers me the most, the reason I no longer feel safe in the backwoods of my own homeland, began one evening when I was 15. Where we live, despite what wildlife officials like to say, there are numerous large and deadly animals. A razorback boar can gore a man's leg deep enough to cripple them or even kill them if they get you on the ground. Gators can grow to just about any length, and the only thing they fear is a bigger gator. And then there are the panthers. Yeah, I said that, panthers. We have heard and witnessed panthers kill and haul a calf weighing well over double their size straight up a tree and then just start gnawing at it. They scream like a terrified woman and can move silently through brush or outright overtake anything. Quite frankly, they unnerve me, but what I found in my own deer lease close to a decade ago has shook me ever since. I never walk those woods unarmed anymore, and I never will. I'm a big guy at 200 pounds or more, and an easy 6'2". While hunting, I always carry a Winchester 7mm rifle, a Taurus Judge revolver, and a kukri knife for brush cutting or emergencies. Nothing, I believed, could stand back up from a straight round with my rifle, but whatever the hell I saw that night, didn't even notice. I'll get to that in a minute. I had shot a hog and followed what I thought was an easy path up a hill near a distant stand we used during the second day of the deer season. I had never such an easy game trail in my life, and to be honest, I was relieved as I only had about an hour of daylight left to bag this thing. So I followed the blood. Not much, but enough to know that I'd hit it. I could physically see the signs of the poor hog being goaded along with its bits of tissue and sizable amounts of blood coating the ground every few feet. But Wait a minute. Was something pulling it along? I hit the crest of a hill, and at the bottom I found what I thought was going to be the hog. All I saw was a leg at first, a mangled and bloody stump lie there alone. I thought it must have died right there, as there was a ton of blood on the ground. Then I saw the body not too far away. It was mangled to hell, with no head. It was mine, as the kill was fresh, with steam coming off the parts that I could see, and that convinced me. I fired my rifle in the air twice to signal for help, and then I searched around the area. Whatever happened to it, man, the poor animal was ripped apart. And the thing that did it didn't leave a single track, because I know my bullet didn't do that. I found a small blood trail leading off from the area where I was, and I left a bandana there to clue the others who were likely on their way to help me. By this point, I had half an hour of daylight left. I used my kukri knife to mark a tree every few feet as I walked, just so the others would know how to find me. Within another 10 minutes, I found the head of the boar, though it wasn't alone. Dozens of bodies, ranging from deer, pigs, cattle, dogs, and even a panther, were lying around it. The cat's decapitated head sat in the center as all this gore lay strewn around it like some kind of sick display. Remembering it as I do now, I only make the joke it was a garden. A crimson-feeded garden, made in the deepest parts of the woods where no man should be foolish enough to wander on his own. Suddenly I heard a noise and snapped out of my horror-stricken state. I chambered around in my rifle and caught a glimpse of what I can only describe as something out of this world. It was thin, palish gray, white skin, its eyes were black, and it had long claws that were still dripping what looked like blood or something from the hog's throat, or I don't know. It ducked behind a tree, and then appeared about 10 feet closer to me without making a sound. I mean, it was just like it materialized right there, from 20 feet away. I didn't give it a chance to get any closer, and put a rifle round through its chest. I say through because I saw no blood, no hole, just the muzzle flash and the damn thing flinch. I knew I hit it at 20 feet, but I fired another just in case. It fucking just bared its teeth at me in what looked like a bloody grin. I shit you not, no 7mm Magnum round leaves anything standing at that range, much less smirking. Its hollow eyes stared at me for a moment, and then its big razor-toothed smile jutted across its face. I could see that it was twice as big as a man's. And then it moved. I can see the thing in my nightmares even now, so when I say its movements were even unnatural, I mean it. It kind of shuffled, I guess is the best way to describe it. It shuffled, I think is the best way to describe it. It shuffled forward with a strange posture. Its arms almost doubled the length of a man's, though it stood just as tall, and its legs were canine-like in nature. It moved awkwardly while walking on its feet and knuckles. I dropped my rifle and reached for my sidearm, but it was in my arm's reach before I could blink. I fell and felt piss soak my pants. I mean, I knew it, man. This was it. I was going to end up being some kind of fucking backwards art project for this crazy fucking monster. That is when I heard the shotgun from behind me to the right, from the trail that I had marked. My father, my uncle, and a close family friend had been nearby, wondering where I was, and heard my shots. Then they completely opened fire on this thing with 2 hunting rifles and a shotgun at point-blank range, and it didn't show a single wound. It just turned to face them, and then back to me, and still had that creepy, bloody grin. After that, it bolted away and vanished into the woods. My dad helped me up and looked at me dead in the eyes, saying something, but my mind just couldn't process it at the time. The gunshots, the strange thing happening, I was out of my head. There was no going back to camp that night. I was in the pickup and on my way home inside of 2 hours. When we made it back to town, I was finally recovering from the shock. My dad and uncle sat me down to talk once we got home and I got cleaned up. These men were Vietnam veterans, yet they looked so pale. I'll never forget the way they looked so pale. My dad gave me a cup of coffee and said that none of the rest of the people I know on this earth need to know what had happened out there. He knew the game warden, and they would quote-unquote take care of things. As for what I saw, he only had this to say. Your great-grandpa knew the Indians that lived in these parts, and they used to warn him of evil spirits. Your grandpa won't hunt out here anymore because of something he saw as a young man. And I've seen men die firsthand, yet something I saw when I got lost as a boy still wakes me up at night. All of us have seen things that we can't explain out there. Great-grandpa, Grandpa, me, and now you. I'm just happy I didn't lose my son tonight, so you take as long as you need to talk about it, all right? The next day, 30 armed men, including a preacher, scoured those woods as my dad picked up our gear and told them where we had last seen the thing. Local officials bought and closed off the land without saying a word to anyone about why. It all just disappeared, and after a few months of therapy, I was doing okay. I only wonder what could have happened. That, and when I'll stop having nightmares of whatever that thing was. A popular internet phenomenon dubbed the closest thing I've ever seen to its description as a rake, or even a wendigo. But none of that matters. Now that I'm a father myself, neither my boys nor I go into those woods alone, because I personally know somewhere out there that thing is waiting, and I'll be damned if my son will be its next victim. The Abandoned Church. This happened around the summer of 1987, and it was completely weird. My best friend Renee and I had borrowed my mom's car to cruise for the day. Living in a small town, there's really nothing else to do for fun. While cruising some back streets of our town, we sort of just followed the road around. The road we were on was not one that I was familiar with, and soon it turned from asphalt to dirt. We just kept driving, singing along with the radio. We had the windows down, letting the wind make a mess of our hair, just having fun. Before we knew it, we had passed an old abandoned church. Curious, we turned around and went back. We parked the car and began the task of checking things out. Upon closer inspection, the church didn't look abandoned. There weren't any weeds, no broken windows, and the inside was spotless. Now, this may not seem odd, but being where we were and given the fact that the church was almost empty, we got kind of spooked. You see, all we found in the church was a medium-sized crucifix. It was sort of laying on the floor like it had fallen from the wall. Renee was into the paranormal and such and decided it would be a cool thing to hang in her bedroom, so we held on to it while we explored the rest of the church. There were a couple of Sunday school rooms, perfectly kept, a tiny bathroom, also neat as a pin. At this point, we began to feel as if someone was watching us, so we decided to make a quick exit. Renee and I drove around for another hour or so and then headed back to my house. She spent the night and went home the next day, taking our find with her. Thank God, that crucifix was giving me the willies. 2 days later, I related our discovery to my friend Hugh, who was enthralled by our outing and wanted to go back and check out the church for himself. I agreed to go along for the ride because he didn't know where it was. We arrived at the church, parked and got out of the car, and immediately I felt a presence, like someone was watching us again. I was ready to get the hell out of there. Hugh had other plans. He had reached the steps before I did and made his way into the church. When I reached the front steps leading into it, I freaked out. They were rotten, and most of them broken. There were weeds growing up through them. I had made my way inside without breaking my neck, only to discover that most of the windows were now broken too, and there were a few trees growing in through the broken ones. The entire inside of the church looked as if it had been abandoned for years. Ceiling tiles on the floor, in some places holes in the wall. Now, this may seem perfectly normal to you, to see an abandoned church and to see that's been neglected for some years. But the weird thing is that only 2 days before, it was in perfect shape. I'm not a rocket scientist, but I know that it takes longer than 2 days for a building to get in such a state of disrepair. All this combined with the feeling that something or someone was watching us scared me silly. Needless to say, Hugh and I beat a hasty retreat. But something followed us. But that's another story for another time. Jeremiah. So, I have depression. Nothing too bad, but with the combination of ADHD, I sometimes forget to take my meds, and that's not a good thing. Sometimes when you have depression, you don't necessarily want to kill yourself, but you still wish you were fucking dead. Like, just not here, Don't really want to put the effort in, but hey-ho, just take me out Donnie Darko style. Just plane engine through the roof. It's not a fun way to be. When you have these feelings for so long, it starts to become normal. It doesn't seem out of the ordinary. It becomes a part of you. You forget that casually saying you wish you were dead makes other people nervous. Yeah, I know, I'm a fucking idiot. I have told teachers before, I'm sorry, I don't think I can come into class tomorrow. I had a panic attack last night and I didn't sleep. Or I tell them that I have depression and I can't seem to motivate myself to get out of bed. I go to a pretty liberal school, so many of the teachers are understanding. However, with the acceptance of past teachers, plus forgetting that saying, howdy, I wish I was dead, I don't think I'm going to get any sleep tonight, I'm not coming to class tomorrow, would garner a very big reaction, I did something incredibly stupid. I sent an email to a teacher saying that I was feeling suicidal, and that I was going to sleep it off. Who the fuck does stuff like this? What normal human being does this? Why? I can't tell you. I can tell you, though, as I have done before, that I guess I'm just a fucking idiot. Unfortunately, my dorm had a fire drill right after I sent the email, and I was away from my computer, so I was not able to respond to the email he sent back, which was frantic, asking me if I was going to hurt myself. He called public safety, and they drove me to the health center, and they shipped my sad, sorry ass off to the observation unit at a local hospital. It was hell. I didn't sleep. I was alone. I couldn't use my phone. I was filthy because I hadn't showered in 3 days, another perk of depression, and I was surrounded by the mentally ill, like mentally ill. I feel bad for feeling this way about them and saying that, because it's not their fault, but holy shit, dude, the people I saw in there. So I woke up to a nurse asking to take my vitals. I had literally just fucking fallen asleep, too, and I was pissed. And I laid in the fucking most uncomfortable bed for hours. I was too afraid to get up. I had no idea where I was, when my mother was coming to get me, when I was getting out. I was the only young adult there. And I didn't know anybody. Finally, my stomach was like, get some food, man, you're gonna starve. So I get up, keep my back to the wall, and grabbed the nearest food tray and sat down at this table that was right outside my room's door. And then he came, right out of the bathroom, in a light blue hospital gown and pants. Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a big African-American guy with a lazy eye and a deep voice. He had freckles. He saw me and smiled, and my entire body was fucking screaming. I know why he's here, and he knows why I'm here. We all had a hard night last night. And I'm thinking to myself, please, Jeremiah, for the love of God, just let me eat this fucking turkey sandwich alone, man. Please, just leave me alone. That was not going to happen. He stood in front of me, rocking back and forth by shifting his weight from the balls to the heels of his feet, and he gives me this big ol' smile. I forced myself to not cry or scream, and I gave him a small smile. And he started talking.
Hi, my name's Jeremiah.
I don't want to talk to him, so I respond, hi, I'm Little Loquax, which is my way of saying, please go away. Again, another big smile. I can't tell where he's looking at because of his lazy eye, and in fact his eyes seem like they're just about ready to pop out of his head. He asks me how I am, if I got any sleep, and then he says,
You know, I just wanted to come over here so no one would bother you. There are some real crazy people. I mean, I know I hear voices in my head, but just don't go talking to anybody here.
I like to think I'm a progressive person. Just because someone hears voices in their head or acts strange doesn't mean that they're evil or inherently out to get you. So Jeremiah actually comforted me a bit. I was afraid, and I thought this adult was trying to comfort a child, or at least a very distraught young adult, in a very scary place. As I started talking to the other people here, like Joni, who gave up on God because he took her little girl away when she was 10 on Christmas Day, or the wig lady, who never really gave me her name but shared her chips with me and drew lots of pictures, that was what Jeremiah was trying to do in his own way. For Christ's sake, he taught me how to play blackjack. But after 3 games, Jeremiah, the 32-year-old man garbed in a hospital gown who heard voices in his head, looked at the clearly scared, dirty 20-year-old girl and asked,
Can I take you out sometime? Do you want to meet up after we both get out of here? I would love to take you out for coffee.
I'm scared. I've never in 20 years of my life been asked out. Not once. I still believe to this day that I am not very attractive, and I'm okay with that because that doesn't detract from who I am. So I was not really equipped with what to do here. Plus, we were in a hospital. Again, we both knew why we were there. We were a danger to ourselves and others. God, I came here in an ambulance. I was not here to date. I was not interested in a 32-year-old man who heard voices in his head trying to pick me up at the observation unit at a hospital. There were nurses right there when he asked me out, and they did nothing. I built up my courage and politely declined, and he said it was no problem, and that he would never force someone to do what they really didn't want to do. Except 5 minutes later, he asked me if I was sure, and when I said no again, he repeated the mantra. I didn't want to play blackjack anymore. I wanted to go home. It didn't matter if Jeremiah was there or not. I was too afraid to go to the bathroom for fear someone would lock me in and maybe try to do something to me. Have you ever been afraid to piss? It's not a good time. Jeremiah was all set to leave, and he wouldn't stop staring at me as the nurses were walking him out. He looked mad and sad and a little obsessive, and I just wanted to crawl away or disappear. He walked out of the observation unit with his stuff, and I never saw him again. So, Jeremiah, thanks for teaching me blackjack, but let's never meet again. Who the hell was my boyfriend? I met my ex-boyfriend, E, I'll call him, a little over a month before my 20th birthday. He was sweet, funny, and incredibly dorky, and I felt like it was love at first sight. But that slowly changed as he began to transform into a completely different person, as it seemed he was two different people that shared the same body. And suddenly, he just became a stranger. To this day, I'm not sure who E is, or if E knows who he truly is. It started with E changing his major from English to physics around the time we first met. He wanted to tap into some sort of higher knowledge, and he felt that studying English was for those who were less intelligent. He began to watch strange New Age conspiracy theory videos on YouTube, and he'd make me watch them with him. And the information they presented was so strange and odd, almost cult-like. He'd email them to all his professors, and I was getting embarrassed for him. E thought these videos told the truth and would help people see some sort of reality. But in actuality, they were just nonsensical, ad-based garbage. He began to read more books, things I can only describe as cult-like literature. Extreme militant atheism, strange books on stoicism and books on how to get rid of emotions, and some strange, bordering New Age physics books. He began to form strange ideals concerning things. He believed that feelings and emotions were beneath him, and stopped trying to have emotions. He believed that all people were a means to an end, and to him, everyone had purpose or usefulness to him, and no one else was a true individual person. Just a tool for E to use. The strange thing about this was that just was one side of E. The other side was the dorky guy who accidentally walked into glass walls and wrote me poems, the one I fell in love with. And after all this time, it still hurts to admit that he would change, though. His voice would change, his personality would change, the entire vibe he gave off changed. Even his face, somehow, would also change. And what's worse was the silly, sweet E never remembered what transpired when he was the uncomfortable, cultish E. That's what I think of him as. He was never in a cult, but the ideas and things he had read reminded me of a cult. The strange E raped me several times, which at the time he knew was rape, but at the same time didn't know it qualified as rape, and I was young and didn't know it didn't matter if it was your significant other. But it was still rape. And the nice, silly E couldn't remember it. He couldn't remember that he had said all disabled and mentally challenged people should be euthanized because they served no purpose to society, and that we needed abortions to be legal so women could abort children who had mental and physical defects. This E wanted a world of idealized, highly intelligent people that were incapable of feeling. The other E wanted to play his guitar and had long hair and wore sandals 24/7. I talked to a therapist about this, and she said E most likely has a form of multiple personality disorder. I broke up with him and haven't seen him in over 3 years, and I haven't had contact with him in 2. Leaving E was very difficult. But I guess I just wanted to share my story to tell anyone reading this is that if you find yourself in a bad relationship but still love the person, you have to leave them, as hard as it may be. Wherever you are, E, I hope you are well. My aunt and the book. When I was a teenager, my aunt died. My mom was the one that found her, peacefully asleep, holding a book while lying in her bed. My mom and my aunt had made a pact that whoever went first would find a way to let the other know if there was more to death than just being dead. Well, the night after she died, my aunt let us know. Mom and I were upstairs with the cat and dog. We were comforting each other and planning the wake when we heard a huge crash downstairs. This was at about 11 in the evening, and we were alone in the house, so we fairly leapt out of our skin. We got down to the library and found that one shelf, out of 20-some-odd shelves, had fallen off the wall. Now, this was in California, a mere mile from the San Andreas Fault, so we shrugged, placed the shelf back on the brackets, and then put the books back on the shelf. Mom did comment that some of the books were actually my aunt's, but we didn't give it much more thought. In the morning, I got a hammer and double-checked the brackets. All was secure. It was now the second day after my aunt's death. Mom and I were still alone as my dad was back east on business. It was about 11 o'clock again, and we were to later learn this was the approximate time of our aunt's death. You guessed it, crash. It was the same shelf. The wall brackets were still firmly in place. This time, however, the books had fallen in an odd way. Most had scattered within a few feet of the wall, as one would expect. The books that Mom had borrowed from my aunt, all of them and only them, were about 20 feet away at the end of a long hallway. My mom was very casual and merely said, "Your aunt always liked to make sure her point was well taken." My dad has always maintained that it was an earthquake, but Mom and I are quite sure it wasn't. We disturbed something. I grew up on a 32-acre farm in rural southwest Virginia. We always heard ghost stories growing up, and I wanted to share a couple of them from the area where I grew up. First, I have to give you a little backstory on the history of the property. My great-grandfather bought a piece of land from a man known to me only as Old Uncle Clem. About 8 years later, after my grandfather bought the property, he was out plowing the field when he saw Uncle Clem walking through the field towards him. Problem was, Uncle Clem had been dead for several years before this happened. Later, my great-grandfather had 3 sons, and divided the property between the 3 of them. My grandfather kept the old farmhouse once occupied by Uncle Clem. As a small child, I was afraid of our kitchen. It always just gave me a creepy feeling. One day, while talking to my great-grandmother, who had come to live with us after she broke her hip, she told me that when she was a young married woman, Uncle Clem had took sick. His wife, Ida, had taken care of him for several years when one day he just died. At his wake, the older woman confessed to my great-grandmother that she had slipped a little something extra into Uncle Clem's morning dose of medicine. That something was rat poison. She had helped him along with the dying, since evidently he wasn't doing it fast enough for her. The kicker was that his sickbed was in what was now part of our kitchen, right where the fridge sat, right where I felt most uneasy. Later on, different members of the family would see a shadowy figure of a woman in 1920s-style clothes walking around the house. I was alone one summer afternoon when I was 16. The rest of the family had gone on a trip to the mall, but I stayed home since I had just gotten my first job and I had to work that afternoon. I was just sitting on the couch when I heard footsteps crossing our long front porch, thinking Dad and the rest of the family had gotten home sooner than I expected. I looked up. The door opened, but instead of my family, it was the shadowy figure of a woman who just continued through the foyer and then walked upstairs. I spent the rest of the day sitting on the porch before I had to go to work. The woods on our property hid a very old secret, an Indian burial ground. We didn't know a thing about it until we had a very hard winter with lots of snow, followed by a wet spring and summer. Sometime in the early fall, after yet another rainy spell, the woods, which kind of sat on a ridge of a hill bordered by a creek and a gravel driveway that led to my other relatives' houses, experienced a small mudslide which unearthed part of the burial ground. My cousin, who discovered the site, showed it to me, and I was interested in the few shards of pottery that I found. We always found arrowheads and pottery when we plowed our garden or one of the fields, so while it was still cool, I just wasn't that interested. I left the stuff where I found it, but my cousin took several things to a local archaeology club. Shortly after that, all hell broke loose on the property. We heard chanting. We saw shadowy figures in the trees, and if you walked through the woods, sticks and rocks would be thrown at you, but you could never find the source of who was throwing them at you. The whole time we would also hear blood-chilling screams and what sounded like wolves howling, and what my grandfather described as the scream of a bobcat. He said it sounds like a cross between a woman screaming and a baby crying. It could have been coyotes, but whatever it was, man, it was an ungodly noise. This went on for a few weeks, progressively getting worse. Finally, we knew what had happened and what we needed to do. The only problem was that only a person with Native American blood could attempt to put a burial ground to rest. We heard that when the spirits are very angry, they will usually give their own the benefit of the doubt before hurting them. I'm the only Native American on my dad's side of the family. My dad has only one child, that would be me, and my mother is of Cherokee descent on both sides of her family. So it was left to me to put the burial ground to rest. I consulted an elder family member on my mom's side and was instructed to return all of the artifacts that had been taken. Take tobacco to offer to the ancestor spirits, and then sage and sweetgrass to burn to do a cleansing. I also had to say a prayer asking for forgiveness for disturbing their final resting place and for peace to return to the land and my family. I gotta be honest, I was scared shitless the whole time, but it worked. After that day, nothing else like that ever happened again. Several years ago, my grandparents died and my dad sold the farm. It is currently being built upon, and most of the woods have been cleared in preparation for the building of a new home. I feel that I should warn the new owners of what they may be unleashing, but I'm not sure what good it would do. So far, the burial ground has not been disturbed. It seems to be set just a little ways from where they are digging, so I'm hoping that they never discover that ground. I have debated on what to do, but I do live far away now. Maybe in a year or two I will pop by and introduce myself as the former owner of the farm and ask how everything is going. And maybe if something's amiss, I will mention what happened to us and what they'll have to do too. Hello, Uncle Josh here. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed these true scary stories from around the world. If you are interested in having your story shared on the air, please email unclejoshscarystories@gmail.com. In the subject line, please let me know the nature of your story. Also, remember to omit any real person's name that is involved in your story, and also send a short note of consent letting me know that I have your permission to share your story. Thanks again for listening. Stay tuned for more of Uncle Josh's true scary stories.